So I think most will be familiar with your life story, but just in case there's someone that's not, let's do the elevator talk on that to get everybody up to speed on how it is, because this is a library, and here we have an author of some 25 books, and some of the books really do tell your autobiography, and so give us just a brief, how in the world did somebody from Chicago, a Cubs fan of all, a Cubs fan of all people. I was born in St. Louis, so a Cardinals fan through and through. But we still love each other in Christ. Goes to show you that the gospel can overcome all barriers. So how is it that you came to faith in Christ?
Yeah, I mean, my background's in journalism and law. I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune and an atheist. My wife, Leslie, who's here, hi, who's here this morning, I call her an agnostic. She was just spiritually confused, I think. And it was through the influence of a Christian nurse who she encountered, who became her best friend, who shared Jesus with her and brought her to church. And Leslie brought me the news that she had become a follower of Jesus, which I thought was the worst news I could get. And I decided to use my journalism training and legal training to investigate Christianity, to try to rescue her from this cult that she's gotten involved in. I thought I could disprove the resurrection. And so I spent 2 years of my life researching various issues involving the historical evidence for the faith, especially the resurrection, until November the 8th of 1981, when I concluded that in light of this avalanche of evidence that I encountered, it would take more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. And that's when the scales kind of tipped. And that's when I repented of my sin, received forgiveness through Christ, and my life, like hers, began to change. I stayed in journalism for a number of years, and then felt calling to full-time ministry in a church, and left to do that at a 60% pay cut, and have enjoyed being part of church ministry now for a number of years, and now we write and travel and speak and have a new center for evangelism and applied apologetics at Colorado Christian University.
So I've met, through the years, people who have acted in films. I've met directors, I've met producers. You're the first person I've ever met that there's been a movie made about his life. Yeah. What is the name of the movie?
The Case for Christ. And it's on Netflix if y'all have Netflix. It's free on Netflix. So.
Well, Penny and I, when it came out in theaters, we actually put down cash and went to go see it.
Awesome.
And it was a great movie. I mean, I really enjoyed on a number of levels. I enjoyed I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the production values. I just thought it was very well done. Tell us, whenever it's a movie about your life, what kind of control or lack of control do you have?
Legally, you have very little control, because what happens is they come to you and say, hey, we want to do a movie about your life, but you'll have no control over it. And the reason is because they have to go out and raise millions of dollars to make the movie. If I had the control at the end, they make this entire movie, and at the end they say, nah, I don't like it, can't use it. Now all these people have lost millions of dollars, so it can't give you veto power. But having been trained at Yale Law School, I knew a few things to put into the contract. One of the things I put into the contract was that I got to choose a screenwriter. And I have a friend who's written 17 movies, but he's also a very good friend. I knew he would protect our story. And so Brian Bird wrote the screenplay, and we consulted with him extensively. We worked with the actors and actresses before the filming. We were on the set for much of the filming. And so we were able to shape it largely. And really, it's about 80 to 85% accurate.
Yeah,
which is very high for a based on true story movie. As you say, most of them are tangentially related to what really happened. Ours is, I mean, there are scenes that are literally word for word what happened, and which is why Leslie cries every time she sees it. In fact, I remember before they released the movie, they sent us a link so we could watch it online. And so I came home one day, and Leslie was watching the movie. I said, "Are you watching the movie again?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "How many times have you seen it?" And what was it, like 15?
At that point, about 13.
13 times.
13
I said,
times.
"Why do you keep watching it?" She said, "I'm trying to get cried out so that when I see it in public, I won't cry." And then we saw it in public, and we both cried. Yeah. Because it's tough. There are things in the movie I'm not proud of because it does tell my story of my pre-Christian life, and I was a hard-drinking, narcissistic, self-absorbed jerk. And so it's not comfortable watching that kind of thing. But we're thrilled with the impact. We talk about how do we take what we learn in theology and what we learn in seminary and use it to reach people for Christ. Well, we've got to use new technology. We've got to use the internet. We've got to use film. Film is the language of young people. Cinema is the language of the millennials and Generation Z. So we ought to be using film effectively to reach people. And the gospel is in the movie. It went all around the planet. In New Zealand, a church rented a movie theater and showed it, and 22 people came to faith. I met a pastor at a conference I was at in Des Moines a few weeks ago, and he said, "My personal ministry, when I meet someone who's not a Christian, I invite him over to my house to watch the movie with me." And I said, "Oh, that's awesome." I said, "What's the response been?" And he said, "Well, 27 people have come to faith." So,
Amen.
And the funny thing too is in France, which is really a post-Christian culture, in Grenoble, it was in the movie theaters for like 9 weeks. And I got an email from a guy in Grenoble, and he said, "We don't know what's happening. There's no money behind it. There's no money to promote it. People just keep coming to this movie." And I think it was just God using it for his purposes. And so you never know. And so I'm enthused about finding new ways to communicate the gospel in a world where people may not pick up a 300-page book.
So now my imagination. Yeah. So in France,
Yeah.
does it have subtitles, or do you speak with a French accent, or how did they?
Yeah, that's a good. I think they subtitled it.
Okay.
Now we did a documentary on the Case for Christ back in 2004. That's been on national television many times. And what's interesting about that is there was a wealthy Christian who paid to have it translated into and dubbed into Chinese. And he had 1 million copies of the DVD made, and we smuggled them into China through Hong Kong. And so if you watch that one, I'm speaking Chinese, which is pretty awesome. Your Chinese not so good. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Accent.
that's a helpful helpful insight, because when we see movies that sometimes they'll say inspired by true
Yeah,
events,
right.
or based on true events. Or the Coen brothers, they'll go ahead and just make a joke out of it. They'll say a true story when obviously everything about it's fiction.
Yeah.
But you're saying it very, very close.
Very close. And because what they do, you're taking a 2-year period of our life, which is my 2-year investigation, and shrinking it down to 90 minutes. So to do that, to tell the story, you have to use composite characters. You have to time shift some things. So given those cinematic realities, it's extremely accurate.
So let's, speaking of shifting, let's shift gears just a little bit. This is a library talk. You are a prolific writer and author. I think I counted 24 or 25 books that you have.
It's like at 43.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
okay,
That
then
includes curricula.
Then you need to you need to update your Wikipedia
I had to
page,
do it
because there's a, a lot
You know
of
what?
stuff there.
Wikipedia is so funny. First time I had a Wikipedia page, I read the entry. I don't know who did it.
Yeah.
I read the entry. There were 4 errors in the first sentence.
Well, that should tell us something.
Yeah. I mean, I was really stunned how inaccurate it was. But what happened was I was a professor of Christian thought at Houston Baptist University for a while, and they said you have to do a CV. And I hadn't done a CV in years, so here I am. So I had to list all my books. So I'm checking. And I told Leslie, I said, no wonder I'm exhausted. I've written 43 books. I had no idea. I would just say more than 20. But actually, some are ancillary. So you'll do a book like The Case for Christ, and then you do an excerpt called The Case for Easter, and add some new things and make it an inexpensive giveaway book. So it's some of them are kind of cheating.
Okay. Well, you, everyone in this room, just about everyone in this room, is required or involved in some type of writing enterprise as students. And so I would really like to pick your brains and find out what your habits are concerning the writing projects. If you don't mind me asking a few things about that. Your degrees are in journalism and law. At what age did you realize I want to be a writer?
I was in kindergarten. My dad used to read the Chicago Tribune every morning, and then he'd come home on the train reading the Chicago Daily News. And so I was exposed and watching him. He was he loved newspapers. In fact, he was the sports editor of the Daily Northwestern when he was at law school, at Northwestern Law School. And so he had kind of an affinity there. And so I watched that and thought, that's what I want to do. So I actually wrote some little books when I was like in first and second grade. I had a friend who would illustrate them, and I did about half a dozen of these little books. And then I started my own newspaper when I was 12 years old. And I had a printing press in my basement. And it was a weekly paper, and I would interview the police chief. It was in a suburb of Chicago, Arlington Heights. And I covered things. I had a column called Doggy of the Week, where I do a feature on a local dog. And my biggest feature, though, and this is what sold my newspaper, was a babysitter's guide. So all these parents are looking for babysitters, and I had a list of all these teenagers in the neighborhood that were willing to babysit. This is before Craigslist and everything. And so that was my big seller. And we sold advertising. I made some money at it.
And how old are you at this time?
I was between 12 and 14.
Okay.
Is when I did about 2 years.
All right.
And Huntley Brinkley, which was the old NBC
I remember that.
Broadcast of news, did a feature on us on the newspaper, and so we got some notoriety on it. But it was I loved newspapers. I had printer's ink in my blood. And then when I went to high school, I started working newspapers in the summer. So I actually moved away from home at age 16, and I lived in a boarding house, and I worked in a county seat newspaper, a daily paper in Woodstock, Illinois. Covered everything, and did that for 3 summers, even before I went away to journalism school. So I just love the action. I love the challenge of creating, literature on the fly, of writing things on deadline, and so I just find, now that was back in the days when newspapers mattered.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about newspapers anymore.
So literature done in a hurry.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
So what kind of deadlines, what kind of obligations, how many words, how often did you have to write?
Well, when I was at Chicago Tribune, I went to Yale Law School on a Ford Foundation fellowship and came back to the Tribune as legal editor. But before I did that, I covered federal court and criminal court, not the same time, at different times for the Tribune. So back then, we had 6 deadlines a day. So my first deadline was at 12:30 in the afternoon, then I had another one at 1:30, another one at 3 o'clock, and then I had another one at 9 o'clock that evening, and then there were overnight deadlines. Of course, you didn't work on all of them. So I would cover, let's say I'm covering a trial, a crime syndicate trial or a political corruption trial. You'd have to leave the courtroom at the lunch break, quick write your story for the 12:30 edition, and then if you had a chance, you could update it for the 1:30 edition and then for the 3 o'clock edition. But then your main deadline's for 9 o'clock at night, which would be your polished one. And most people, that's the one they got in the morning. But they also had updates of that at 1 in the morning, at 2 in the morning, and so forth. So it was a continual process. And so I learned to respond to deadlines, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Okay. The good part of it is it requires you to be productive. The bad part of it is, it's like Pavlov's dog. When there's a deadline, you're productive. When there's not so much.
Well, that brings up, that's a good segue to the experience, I would say, for many of our students in that, okay, how do I develop the discipline of being a productive writer where I don't have the deadline breathing down my neck? Because, I guess what I'm asking is, how did those particular disciplines and skills transfer over from being a journalist to being an author of books?
Well, they translated over in the sense that now that I have a 4-book contract, for instance, right now with HarperCollins, and I'm on the 3rd book of that contract. And I have a deadline. My deadline is June 30th of next year for my next book. So I have to pace myself. My ministry in my book writing is that I'm not a scholar, but I'm a bridge between scholars and everyday folks. And that's where God uses my journalism training. So what I do is I go out and I interview scholars. And I ask them the tough questions I had when I was a skeptic. And I try to see if they can give answers that satisfy people. And then I create this narrative about that experience. Mm-hmm. So like in the Case for Christ, I interviewed 13 scholars with PhDs from Brandeis and Cambridge and Yale and major universities. And trying to put the cookies on the bottom shelf, as they say. In other words, to write their stuff and their interview in a way that the average person can understand it. So that's how, so for me, in this new book, for instance, I'm working on, there'll be probably 14 chapters, 12 to 14 chapters. And I've got a deadline, so I've got to pace myself. And I have to say, okay, so far I've done 4 interviews, so I'm a little behind. But I have another one scheduled in a couple of weeks. And for each of my interviews, I've got to read at least 10 books, because I've got to read all the writings of the person, the main writings of the person I'm interviewing, as well as books attacking that person in contrary positions, so I understand the whole scope of the issues. And then I have to create a set of questions. So there's a lot of preliminary stuff before I do an interview. So I try to pace it so that I'll finish up in time for the deadline. Now, the ugly truth of publishing is that over 90% of authors miss their deadline. Mm-hmm. So it's standard to miss your deadline. Everybody expects you to miss your deadline. I just try to miss it less than other people, But I don't think I've ever made it. Have I ever made a deadline? No, I haven't made a deadline. But I'm close. I'm fairly close.
Yeah. So this is like horseshoes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, horseshoes and hand grenades. Those are 2 things that just need to be close.
Yeah.
So. The problem, though, you hit on, which is the deadline thing. The challenge is setting the internal deadlines to meet the big deadline.
Well, can we go ahead and talk, because what you're describing, what I hear is somebody who is very much on a marathon rather than a sprint.
Yes.
And you talk about pacing yourself, June of next year. So how do you, in other words, how does Lee Strobel organize his day and his week so that he gets X number of words written or X number of pages? Tell us how does that discipline work?
To me, the book writing process isn't really a marathon as much. You use the word sprint and marathon. To me, it's a series of sprints.
Okay.
Because I try to break the book up. The average book is 8 to 12 chapters. That's the average book.
And how many words would that end up being?
60,000 and up.
Okay.
Most of my books are about 100,000, 110,000. But your contract says 60,000, so that you can get by on that. But generally, my books are about 100,000. But I don't think in terms of words or word count. I think in terms of the sprints. So if I've got 12 chapters, I have 12 sprints. And what do I have to do for each of those sprints? I've got to come up with the topic. I've got to identify the scholar I want to interview. That's a big process. Who's the best person? I have to approach them and sell them on the idea of allowing me to do it. I pay them because I think it's only fair. I'm using their expertise. I have to then read their books and read the opposing books. I've got to formulate the questions. I have to travel to where they are. I tape record the interviews. I use a wonderful website. If you're doing research, you ought to know about this website. It's called rev.com, R-E-V.com. And they have a transcript service. And they will, if you record an interview, or let's say you're on YouTube and you see a 2-hour YouTube video, and you think, oh man, I'd love a transcript of this that I could really work with, but I don't want to sit there for 2 hours. And all you got to do is go to Rev and put the link in, or if you do your own recording, you just plug your recorder in and download it, and they charge $1 a minute, or you can get dirty transcripts, which are a little speedier for like 10 cents a minute, and they'll do the transcript, and they do it like that. Used to take me days
Yeah.
to do a transcript, days, and I hated it. Now, I just did one the other day. I interviewed Dr. Chad Meister, a philosopher at, you know Chad?
I know
Yeah,
Chad.
great guy. He was a volunteer in my ministry when he started out. And so that interview was about 3 hours long, and I plugged it into Rev, and they had the transcript within about 4 hours. It's fantastic.
You've just changed their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you, it saved you all this time. And the new service, the 10 cent, which is a little dirtier version, golly, that's cheap.
Yeah.
I use a dollar thing because I need it real accurate. But so anyway, so I see it as a series of sprints, and I tell people going to do a book, for instance, or a huge project like a doctoral dissertation. If you think about it as being a 100,000 word project, you're going to freak yourself out, you know.
They freak out on a 3,000 word paper.
Yeah. Think about them shorter bites, shorter sprints to achieve that. Now, my problem is, you asked about my schedule and so forth. My problem, back to the deadline thing, is I have very sloppy work habits. And the reason is I'm deadline driven. Mm-hmm. So if my deadline is approaching, I'm working 24/7. I'm up in the middle of the night, I'm working constantly. But like right now, June of next year, okay, let's go on vacation. I'm going to play with the grandkids.
I'm not sure I want you to.
Yes. You just got to have strong deadlines. That's the thing. So I get up about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I do some email, and we have some breakfast, and then we say, let's go out to lunch. And then we go out to an early lunch, and we get back about 1:30, and then I say, I should start maybe working. And then and then I say, no, there's other things I could do. And so I'll start to work a little bit. And honestly, I don't have good work habits. The only reason I'm productive is because of the deadlines. I have a friend named Bill Butterworth. He was voted and received the honor as the #1 public speaker in America. So he's a humorist, but he's also a theologian in his own right, mm-hmm. and is a terrific speaker, does a lot churches and fantastic. Anyway, he writes books as a ghostwriter. And so a person who wants to do a book but isn't a writer will hire him to do the book for them and to interview him. But he's so disciplined. He gets up first thing in the morning. He breaks down the project. I need to do 2,000 words a day in order to meet this deadline. And so I'm going to sit down at 7 a.m. and I'm going to work till 2 in the afternoon. And I'm going to write my 2,000 words every day before I do anything else. And he tells me this, and I said, I just want to hug you. That's so fantastic. I wish I could do that, but I can't.
Yeah.
I'm just in my bad habits, and so the deadlines drive me. And
but the deadlines are effective for you.
That's right. And,
so if students have a deadline on a paper,
yes,
this is a grace.
Yes,
this is a good thing.
It is a good thing, because you know what? Honestly, most of us would be very unproductive if there were no deadlines.
Right.
We have good intentions. Someday I want to write a book. But we never get it done.
Right.
You got to have a deadline. You got to have some enforcement. And
well, let's talk a little bit then about some of the projects you have done. You have, of course, the Case for series.
Yeah.
So what would be, most everyone is familiar with the Case for Christ.
Yeah.
If you don't have it, my encouragement to you is get multiple copies so that whenever you have that person who is the skeptic or who is not, you have those kind of obstacles, you say, I have got just the book for you. I do that often, where just hand them a copy and say, just keep it.
Yeah.
It's about, because you can get, 11, 12?
Oh, you can get the
you can get
the mass market version. Cover price is $9, and they discount it to about $6.
Yeah. It's worth the expense to have that on hand. So you have the Case for Christ.
Yeah.
Say some of the other series that you have that you like, that you feel really good about.
Yeah, the Case for Creator. I think it's up here. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Case for Creator, which is scientific evidence for God. So it looks at cosmology, physics, biochemistry, genetics, human consciousness. So it's the affirmative case. I do critique neo-Darwinism in it, but primarily it's the affirmative case for God from science. And then the Case for Faith I did a national survey through George Barna, and I asked a cross-section of Americans, if you could ask God any one question and you knew he'd give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? And I took the top 8 objections or questions that people have and went to experts and scholars, and that book answers those questions. So that's the case for faith. I have the case for Easter, which is an inexpensive giveaway book. You can get them for $1 on Amazon that looks at the evidence for the resurrection. The case for Christmas, and by the way, this is a time of year when I call my publisher and I have to buy them. They send me 100 copies of the case for Christmas, because it's a inexpensive book. You can get it for $1 each online that you can give away around Christmas. So around this time of year, I'll start at a restaurant, I'll leave a nice tip, and I'll engage with the server and sign the book for them and leave them a copy of the case for Christmas. But it's a great way to get out the message of Christ. The case for grace, one of my favorites, is a book of incredible stories of God's grace in saving the most unlikely candidates for conversion. So it's drug abusers, it's homeless, it's one guy that murdered 20,000 people. In fact, I had so many extraordinary stories of God saving and changing the lives of these people. I realized I got to have a normal person in this book, because people are going to read this book and say, well, these people needed God. I don't need God. I'm a nice guy, you know. So I had to find a real normal guy. And I don't know if you know Craig Hazen from Biola University.
Yeah.
Okay, he's head of their apologetics program. Just the nicest guy you'll ever meet. Yeah. So I interviewed him about how he realized he needed forgiveness through Christ.
Nice guys need Jesus too.
Oh, I should have titled that. I like that. That's good. I'm going to write that down. Maybe my next book. So that's the case for grace. My new book is the case for miracles, which, I believe in the miracle of the resurrection, which brought me to faith. I believe the miracles of the New Testament and so forth, because I believe they're well documented. But I had the question, does God still do miracles today? How do we know? Is there good evidence that God still divinely intervenes in people's lives? And so I spent 2 years investigating the supernatural. And that book looks at that issue, which is fascinating. So that's the case for miracles. And then I have the case for hope, which is a little gift book that for people who are struggling with depression or with difficult life circumstances, to say there is hope. And so I think that's all the case books. And then I've done a series of other books. I did What Jesus Would Say to Madonna and to Bill Clinton and to all these other famous figures. Mm-hmm. That was an interesting book. I did a book called Inside the Mind of Unchurched Harry and Mary.
Yeah, I
remember that? That was my first Christian book.
Yeah.
My first book was a secular book, as far as a Christian, called Reckless Homicide. And it was about the Ford Pinto trial. These people are too young to remember the Ford Pinto, but the Ford Pinto was a car designed by Ford Motor Company that had the unfortunate tendency to blow up when hit from behind in a moderate or low-speed crash. 65 people burned to death in Pintos that should not have. They should have walked away. And they were criminally charged in the killing of 3 girls, Christian girls, who were killed in a car crash. And I covered that trial, and I happened to get these secret Ford memos from Ford Motor Company that proved that Ford knew in advance that the danger of the car. So I did that book, and anyway.
Well, speaking of your experience as a journalist and dealing with criminal cases, and you as an author, about 2011, you did something a little different that I found very interesting, in that you wrote a work of fiction called The Ambition.
Yeah.
And it's a grown-up book. I mean, it has murder, it has greed, you have a megachurch pastor that's running for tell us about the book, and how in the world did you think, okay.
Well, all I'd written is nonfiction. I'm so wed to facts as a journalist that even when I tell an anecdote in a sermon or something, I got the facts are all exactly right, and I just try to get everything accurate. Well, my daughter is a novelist. She's had half a dozen novels published under her maiden name, Lee Strobel, and contemporary fiction. She's very talented. And she said to me, Dad, you should write a novel. And I said, I can't write fiction. I'm a journalist. She said, I'll give it a try. It'll spread your wings a little bit. I said, all right, I'll give it a shot. Well, Dudley Delfs, who's a fiction editor at HarperCollins, kind of took me under his wing and coached me a bit on writing a novel. So I wrote this novel. And the novel has true stuff in it from my experience in Chicago. For instance, I talk a lot about judicial corruption. And the cases that I talk about in the book are true. I mean, they really happened, but I fictionalize them. And so there's a lot of true things in the book. But it's a John Grisham type legal thriller about a megachurch pastor who's politically ambitious and is trying to get appointed to an open Senate seat after the senator dies, and so he's kind of questionable, and the crime syndicate's involved, and there's a murder and all this stuff, and so I wrote this book, and I was pretty proud of it. I mean, I thought it was okay, and it was published. It bombed. And I have stacks of this book in my attic. If anybody wants a copy, let me know. Because they said, hey, Lee, your book is going out of print, and we'll give you as many you want at $1 each. So give me all you got, because my great-great-grandkids are never going to see it unless I keep a few copies around. So what we found out is very interesting. My tribe, my readership, doesn't read fiction generally. I tend to write to people like me who like facts, who like data, who like, evidence. And those kind of folks don't often translate. So if you go on Amazon, it's interesting, you'll see people who bought this book also bought, and they'll mention other books. Well, if you go to my books, it never shows a novel under these other books. So my tribe doesn't follow that. We thought some would follow, and just because I wrote it, maybe read it. That didn't happen. So we tried to sell the movie rights. That didn't go anywhere. So it's kind of a dead issue, so thanks for bringing it up. You don't have to have
well,
a big
I was thinking hopefully you and C.S. Lewis,
he was better than me, that's for sure.
Well, what apologetics writers in the past or in the present have had the greatest influence on you that you'd say, boy, that was really good?
Oh, golly. When I was doing my investigation into Christianity, that was in the late 70s, there was very little out there in apologetics. Norman Geisler had one book, I think. Josh McDowell had a couple of popular level books. There was very little. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, there's a lot out there, and a lot of it's really good. For instance, I have a friend named J. Warner Wallace, who's he was a homicide investigator, detective. He would solve cold cases, so he would solve 30-year-old murders that nobody else could solve. He's been on Dateline so often they call him the evidence whisperer, and so he was an atheist like I was, but he uses detective skills to investigate the New Testament to try to determine is it trustworthy, and spent a couple years doing that and coming to faith and getting a degree in apologetics, and now he writes and speaks and still does the homicide investigations too.
They call it cold case Christianity?
Cold case Christianity. I ended up writing the foreword to it, and it's terrific. Just a different take, just a different approach. My friend, late friend, Nabil Qureshi, who was a Muslim turned Christian. He was a medical doctor. He was challenged to investigate Christianity. He did. And became an incredible evangelist to the Islamic community. And he wrote a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And I remember he sent it, he said, would you write the foreword? And I said, sure. So he sent me the manuscript. And I remember one night I'm reading, it was late at night, and I'm reading the first part of the book. And I said, this is fantastic. And I called him up, I said, where did you learn to write? I mean, it is a remarkably well-written book, and the content is fantastic. And so when I meet people who are from that background, who are Muslim, that's the first book I recommend to them. It's really, really, really good. And then, there's Mark Middleberg, who's been my ministry associate now. We've been best friends and buddies since 1987. And we've done a bunch of books together. Including a new devotional called the Case for Christ Devotional, which is a 180-day devotional based on apologetics. So we do a lot of stuff together. His stuff is terrific. You talk about putting cookies on the bottom shelf. He is probably the best person I've ever encountered to communicate complex theological truths and apologetics arguments into everyday language. He's just phenomenal at it. He has a degree in philosophy of religion from Trinity. And so his stuff is terrific to give away and so forth. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. Of course, C.S. Lewis, everybody, he's a beginning point and an end point for a lot of people, just incredibly profound. So those are some that come to mind.
Well, let me open the floor for questions, or open the questions to the floor. What questions might you have from what you've heard him say, or you've always wanted to have the opportunity to ask Lee Strobel certain things? I've picked his brains about writing. What questions do you have? Yes?
I have one. You mentioned how you stayed in journalism for quite a while
Yeah.
after you became a Christian. Did you notice any changes in how you did your journalism?
Oh, that's a good question.
Do I
That's a
need to
great
repeat
question.
the question? Yeah. We're recording. So
Yeah.
what she asked is that how did coming to faith change the way you did journalism, or did it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember coming to faith on November the 8th of 81 and coming into work the following day and looking around the newsroom for the first time as a Christian. And we had 1,000 people in that newsroom that worked in that newsroom. You can imagine, that was back when newspapers were really, the happening place. And I looked around and I could identify 3 who were Christians that I was sure were. Now, there were probably some others, but there were only 3 that I was sure. It's not a profession that attracts a lot of Christians. And so the first thing that changed me was looking around and seeing how undiverse this newsroom is. We talk about racial diversity, we talk about a lot of different kinds of diversity. One kind we don't talk about is spiritual diversity. New York Times, actually, their senior editor did talk at one point and say we need to do a better job of getting religious diversity in our newsroom. And that opened my eyes for the first time and thought, we are a very homogenized group of people when it comes to faith. We're a bunch of skeptics. And yes, our profession tends to attract that, but we need to then counter that in some way. So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing is I became an editor shortly after that at a newspaper in Missouri. And so here I am, I'm a boss at a small newspaper. I have 44 employees in the newsroom. And I realized I need to run this as a Christian. And the first thing I did is I hired a religion writer, because I thought, more people go to church every weekend than go to every sporting event in America. And yet newspapers don't cover religion very much. So I hired a guy. Today, he happens to be the president of the American Bible Society. So he's grown quite a bit. So I noted I wanted to be able to cover that stream of news and cultural significance to the readership that had not previously been covered. We did some investigative reporting back then into some prison conditions, into something very controversial, because we were the home of the University of Missouri, and we did an expose of the basketball program. And we were not very popular in town, an expose of illegal money transactions and things. And so I got our team together and I said, look, we have to be incredibly fair. We have to be balanced. We have to tell both sides of the story. We can't get ahead of our skis. We've got to be honest. So I really tried to enforce a policy of honest reporting and real conscientious reporting to tell both sides of stories. I remember telling my staff, because they were 90%, well, except for the religion guy, they were all non-believers. And I said, if you write a story on a topic like abortion, when I read your story, I don't want to be able to tell if you are pro-life or pro-choice. I want to read that story and say, I have no idea where the writer of that story stands, because he really or she really tells both sides. And so I believed in the old, quote unquote, objectivity reporting. We can never be totally objective, but we need to strive for that. And so I told people, especially in these controversial issues where there are people of faith often look differently than the people who typically run newsrooms, we have to be able to write that in a way that a Baptist would read it and say, I don't know if that guy is pro-abortion or not. So that was ever more important for me. It was important to me previously, but ever more important as I came to faith. I did identify a few people as time went by who were fellow Christians, and we kind of formed a little organization of Christians in secular journalism to try to encourage each other and pray for each other and try to find ways we could be better at what we do. I remember telling the Christians I knew in journalism, you have to be better than your colleagues. You have to be the best person in the newsroom because they will not respect you and they won't respect your faith if you're a lazy and an inaccurate and an unfair reporter. You've got to be the best. And so that's what we strive to be. And I think it's incumbent on Christians, regardless of the profession God has us in, we got to be the best at what we do. The Bible says, whatever you do, do heartily as unto the Lord. And so I stress that to the Christians who are in the newsroom. So those are some things. I think, you face a difficult position, though, when you become an editor. You don't want to be perceived as someone who's going to be biased against the non-believers. If you're known as being a Christian, you have to be very careful to be even-handed. I do remember once I went on a missions trip to India and for 3 weeks, and I came back, and one of the reporters said, well, tell us about your trip. And I said, and I'm wrestling with how much can I really say in this secular context as their boss. And I said, well, golly, why don't we, during lunch hour, why don't we all bring a lunch tomorrow and we'll go into the conference room and we'll just have, bags, and I'll show you my slides and tell you the story. So we did. They all brought their lunch, and I figured on lunch hour, it's free time, we can talk about whatever. So I showed them the slides of people coming to faith and baptizing people in the Krishna River and all this stuff. And I'll never forget that the time was clicking down, and we were like 2 minutes to the end when we all had to go back to work. And I turned on the lights, and I said, anybody got any questions? And a guy named Pete, one of our writers, raised his hand. He said, you talked about these people becoming Christians. What does that involve? Mm-hmm. And I thought,
what a nice segue.
What a nice segue.
Yeah.
But I only had, by that time, about 90 seconds to summarize the gospel. And I did. And you know what? I just heard last week, I spoke in Chicago at an event, and a woman came up to me who'd been on my staff back then. And she, I don't know if she was a Christian then, but she is now. And she told me that one of the guys in that room, who was actually my equal at the paper, a guy who I never thought would come to faith, really a hard-bitten editor, has now given his life to Christ. And, it just shows, we can never predict what God is going to do. So that's some ways that things change.
Excellent question. Next question.
Yeah,
yes. Carson.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Strobel. Your books were really helpful to me in college.
Oh, great.
Case for Christ and Case for the Creator, especially when I was at a secular university and sorting through
Yeah, great.
skepticism.
You were part of Crew?
No,
Oh, okay.
it's not a Baptist Collegiate Ministry.
Okay, great.
Yeah, down in Georgia. So my question for you is, I know you've been to a lot of college campuses for debates or panel
Yeah.
discussions. I think I was listening to a Tim Keller, Jonathan Haidt discussion at New York University the other day, and one of them remarked that they thought there were actually fewer debates and discussions like that on college campuses these days about religion, where you have a Christian and an atheist kind of kindly debating each other.
Right.
I was curious from your perspective if you feel like the landscape has shifted any at college campuses in terms of people being
Let me repeat it.
open to truth from historical empiricism.
Yeah.
You look into these facts,
Right.
Versus just arriving at truth from personal experience. This is what I feel, and So I didn't know if you would agree with that.
So,
Seeing that shift.
Yeah.
Great question, Carson. The question that Carson has asked is, how has the college campus situation and environment and ambiance changed? There are those who are saying, observing, there seems to be fewer debates or a less of a willingness to have an objective conversation. How do you see the landscape changing in that way on college campuses and I guess in culture in general?
Yeah, I don't do that much on college campuses, to be honest. Most of my ministry is not on college campuses. But I do a lot of debate organizing. I'm not a debater myself, but I've organized and moderated quite a few. There is, in one sense, fatigue that can come in because so many people walk away feeling like at loggerheads with the outcome of the debate. And so why go through that again? I've heard that before, or it didn't change my mind the first time, it's not going to change my mind the second time. And so there might be some fatigue with that. And as you say, there may be some, in an age where you have your truth and I have my truth, I'm not that interested in objective truth and so forth. But my experience has been that overall in culture, there's a great interest in debates and a great curiosity about that kind of encounter. I did a TV show for 2 years, a national network TV show called Faith Under Fire. And it was just debates. It was and of course they were short. They were a TV show, and I was an hour program, and we'd do maybe 3 or 4 little 15-minute debates between a Christian and a Muslim, between a Christian and an atheist, between a Deepak Chopra I had on, New Ager versus a Christian. And our ratings were bigger than Larry King, who was on CNN at the time. But our network went out of business, and so the show ended. But we found there was quite a bit of interest. The debates that I've moderated, we've had incredible receptivity when we put them on satellite or we put them on through the internet and to churches around the country. So a few years ago, for instance, I moderated a debate out in California between the guy who sued to have under God removed from the pledge and from coins and stuff, Dr. Newdow, and a Christian apologist. And we had that went, we beamed that into almost 1,000 churches around the country who then invited people to watch it on big screens. So we had a lot of interest in that. I find in my personal ministry that if I run into someone who's a really strong skeptic, I'll say to them sometimes, would you be interested in hearing a debate between one of the smartest Christians in the world and one of the smartest atheists in the world? Would that interest you at all? Well, almost all of them say, well, yeah, that would be interesting. Okay, then we go on YouTube, and I show them the debate between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens. Mm-hmm. And at Biola University a few years ago. And there's always interest. So I think there's a role for it. I think it is possible that in this day when people have their own truth and so forth, there may be some who may not buy into it.
Greg? Yes, question.
You've got a genius for structuring things in powerful ways that we can use. And when you first converted, you were still among journalists. And
Yeah.
Journalists are bold. They're not afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
And they, not ribbing you, but when they would approach, some of them may approach you and ask you about your faith. And I think the best way to prepare is to pray regularly. But,
Yeah.
And I don't do that well enough, but still I found that it works better when I have.
Yeah.
But did you get a structured way to respond or to cipher what the genuineness of their intent and how you can respond genuinely and just, did you get a way to?
You talking
Let
about,
me repeat
you
the
talking about the
question.
colleagues?
Colleagues and
Yeah.
others too that might come up to you.
Yeah,
and
gotcha.
They found out your conversion.
Yeah.
And they want to.
So whenever you converted, you're in the journalism world, how did you witness or how did you share your faith with
Yeah.
other journalists when the opportunity arose?
It was very interesting, the reaction I got. of course, they would all say to me, yeah, that's great, good for you, you know. But then behind the scenes, I heard people comments like, Strobel's got Jesus now. You know, Strobel's gone crazy. You know, there was all kinds of reactions. And I found that not a lot of them were that curious about what led me there. But some were. And I'll tell you the story where I was a new Christian and I had never really shared my faith before. And so, like you had mentioned, I prayed. It was the beginning of a day, and it was going to be a hard day. We had a lot of deadlines coming up. It was going to be, you know, you get a list every day as an editor of all the upcoming stuff that day. There's going to be a news conference on such and such. This trial is going to come to a verdict. You know what's basically going to come, and then other things will happen too. But I'm looking at the list, and I'm realizing it's going to be a bad day. It's going to be a busy day. So I prayed. I'm a new Christian. I said, God, I need your help. Because in the past, I would have lost my temper. I would have flown off the handle. Please help me handle this day in a way that will be a good witness to my fellow journalists. God answered that prayer. And it was remarkable that it all stayed together. Well, at the end of the day, my boss came up. And he said, Strobel, man, I watched you today. I can't believe how you kept your cool. I mean, this was a really bad day. You really handled this well. And then earlier he invited me to play golf on a Sunday, and I said, oh, I can't, I'm going to be at church. So he knew I was a Christian. So he said to me, so is there a connection between that and the fact that you go to church on Sunday? And so I kind of froze because I'd never shared my faith before, and I'd never been taught how to do it or anything. And so I kind of had a split-second decision to make there. Whoa, what do I do? Do I make a joke of it? Hey, you know what happens in church stays in church, you know? Or what do I do? And so I split-second prayer, God, what do I say? And I said to him, do you really want to know? And he said, yeah. So I said, let's go in your office. So we went into his office, closed the door, and for the next 45 minutes, I shared my faith. It was the most inept example of witnessing that has probably ever occurred on planet Earth. And I'd not been trained in this. I didn't know what I was doing. I'm stumbling around. I'm trying to tell about all this investigation I did. It's incoherent, but I'm passionate. And I explained the gospel as best I could. And I remember, and by the way, his parents had both been killed in an airplane crash several years earlier. And it had made him hardened against God. And I knew that. And so I was trying to take that into account. And so at the end of the 45 minutes, I walked out of that office. And it was as if my entire life had been a motion picture up until that time. And it was filmed on black and white film, 16 millimeter, scratchy sound, that old, crummy black and white movie. That was my life. But that 45 minutes was like Technicolor with Dolby Stereo. That changed my life because I said, I need more of this in my life. This is what my life needs to be about, those kind of conversations, leading people toward faith. And so that changed my life, and I ended up leaving journalism within a short period after that, and to spend my life, the best hours of my day, sharing Christ with others. So he, to this day, he's not a believer. He was really affected by his parents being killed, and it's a hard thing to get beyond. But I'm still in contact with him and praying for him. I mentioned this other colleague that did come to faith. There were a few that expressed curiosity. But I think a lot of them, it was like touching the third rail on a subway. You don't do that. Who knows what I'm going to find out. Yeah, Strobel, good for you. They were condescending a bit.
One last question. Nancy.
Yeah, speaking of some of those types of conversations that you want to spend your life on.
Yeah.
And yesterday you mentioned having I guess it was a spiritual discovery or like a
Yeah.
seeker-friendly kind of group at your
Yeah.
church. And it sounds like this is very much a part of your personal life. My husband and I are having a lot of non-believers into our home very regularly, and
Awesome.
we're trying to keep the door open for questions, but we're not apologists.
Yeah,
by
that's
any
all right.
stretch.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, like, what can we do do?
Yes.
What can we do with our churches?
Yes.
Let me repeat the question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, for somebody who doesn't feel like they're a great journalist or they're an expert and apologist, yet they are very interested in reaching their friends and neighbors, and they're having their doors open.
Yeah.
What would you recommend for them? What can they do?
Yeah, I mentioned in the chapel thing about these spiritual discovery groups that I think are the next wave of evangelism. And the reason I say that is Generation Z and millennials and so forth, young people, love to talk, right? They love to tell their opinion. They love to discuss things. They're social in that way. And so what we did at our church in Chicago is I hired a guy named Gary Poole who started doing these kind of spiritual discovery groups at Indiana University when he was a new Christian in a secular school. And he would invite his fellow students to come to talk about spiritual stuff. And he learned how to do these groups, how to, you don't want to be outnumbered by the non-believers. So you want like half a dozen non-believers, and then generally 2 leaders of the group, a husband, wife, or a Christian and an apprentice. Christian who's going to, and so he learned how to do these groups. So I hired him and I said, just organize these groups at our church. Pretty soon he had 1,100 non-believers in these groups. We tracked them over a period of years, and guess what we found out? If a non-believer joined one of these groups and stayed in it, 80% came to faith in Christ. 80%. There's a church in California that copied our format and does these groups. They've never had a non-believer join a group and not become a Christian. 100%. They all become Christians. This is dynamite. The Alpha thing, you've probably heard of Alpha. Alpha is kind of a permutation of this, but this is a little bit different. And so I'm very bullish on these groups. I really believe they can be a next wave. I think every church ought to offer these groups. Any church, whether it's liturgical, it doesn't matter what your format is. Any church can have these groups. It's exceedingly easy to get people into these groups. And here's the key. You said you're not an apologist necessarily. You don't need to be one. In fact, here's an interesting fact. The worst leaders of these groups are the apologists. And the reason is they disrupt things or they short circuit things. So somebody will express, my dad just died a couple of weeks ago, and man, where's God in that? How can there be a God? He allows death and all this stuff. And the apologist will say, oh, well, let me explain to you why they have evil and suffering in the world. And yeah, I've got a 5-point sermon on that. I could give a sermon on that. And so they give a sermon on that, and to which the person says, oh, okay. And it short circuits everything. Yeah. We teach people who lead these groups not to answer the questions. Strategically, as a way of answering the question. And here's what we mean by that. So if someone like that asks, why does a loving God allow pain and suffering in the world? Instead of giving an answer, we train them to ask a follow-up question. The follow-up question is, in light of all the possible questions in the universe, why is that the one you want to ask God? And then they get to the real personal side. Then they get to the fact that their father died or their wife has cancer or whatever it is. And now you can minister to them on a personal, emotional level. And we find that that's the level where people are more open than just sparring over facts. So the key thing to understand about these groups is you are not the Bible answer man or the Bible answer lady who sits there and takes tough questions from people in the group. No, you're there to facilitate a discussion. And you listen to all kinds of heresy and wild stuff that these people say, and you bite your tongue and you let them talk, but you ask them questions. How do you know that's true? And where did you learn that? And it helps them diagnose the fact they don't really know what they believe. And then it opens your possibility for you to tell your story and how you came to faith and why you believe Christianity is true. I think these groups are absolutely dynamite. And so one of the things we're doing at our center in Colorado is trying to equip churches and pastors to spawn these groups in every church. If you want to learn how to do these groups, like for instance, how do you get people into groups? I said it's easy. And people say, it can't be easy. No, it is really easy. I prevailed on Gary to write a book because I said, you got to help people do these groups. So he wrote a book. We call these groups spiritual discovery groups, but back then we call them seeker small groups. And so that's the name of the book, Seeker Small Groups. It is an A to Z guide on how you can do a group like this, or how you as a church leader can organize a ministry like this to have these groups. It's fantastic. Gary still consults with churches around the country and doing these groups. And I really think it's the future because it facilitates discussion that people really want to have. People are more interested in talking about God than we give them credit for.
So that's,
We think they're going to be standoffish. We think they're going to be hesitant. Get them talking. The biggest challenge of these groups is they're only an hour and 15 minutes. Every session is only an hour and 15 minutes, or it's strictly enforced. You can't shut people up. Once they start talking, you can't stop them. And these groups just become incredibly robust and exciting and fun. So anyway, I'm excited about that. I'm going to mention it tomorrow in chapel, but I think there's a lot of potential there for reaching people.
so the book
especially young
is
people.
called,
Seeker Small Groups.
and it's by Gary Poole.
Gary with 2 R's, Poole. I once was talking about these groups, and I said seeker small groups, and a woman came up to me later and she said, why are these groups secret? I said, no, not secret, seeker, like a spiritual seeker.
Well, on this book recommendation, we will have to close our conversation. What a delight it's been to get to hear from Pastor Strobel. Why don't you join me in showing our appreciation to him?